Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your muscles had been given permission to grow far beyond their normal limits. Not because you trained harder, not because you ate more protein, but because one tiny genetic signal that normally tells your muscles, enough, had stopped working. This sounds like science fiction, but something remarkably close to it has already been seen in mice, cattle, and even humans. The molecule at the center of this story is called myostatin, also known as GDF8. And the strange part is that myostatin is not a muscle-building hormone. It does almost the opposite. Myostatin acts like a biological brake on skeletal muscle growth. Your body uses it to help keep muscle development within a workable range. When myostatin activity is reduced or lost, that brake becomes weaker, and muscle can become unusually large. So what would actually happen if you had a mutation that disabled myostatin? Would you become naturally muscular? Would you become stronger? Could you build muscle without exercise? And if this sounds like the ultimate genetic advantage, why hasn't evolution simply removed myostatin altogether? That is where the story becomes much more interesting. The discovery of myostatin began in the 1990s, when scientists were investigating a large family of signaling proteins called the TGF-beta superfamily. In 1997, Alexandra McPherron, Ann Lawler, and C-Jin Lee identified a new protein in mice called growth and differentiation factor 8, or GDF8. It was later widely known as myostatin. The researchers did something especially revealing. They disrupted the gene responsible for producing myostatin in mice. The result was dramatic. The animals developed substantially more skeletal muscle than normal mice. Individual muscles could weigh roughly 2 to 3 times as much as those of ordinary mice, with increases involving both muscle fiber size and, during development, muscle fiber number. These became famous as mighty mice. And suddenly scientists had a powerful clue. Maybe myostatin was not telling muscles how to grow. Maybe it was telling them when to stop. But the mouse was only the beginning. A few months later, McPherron and Lee reported something even more striking in cattle. Some breeds, particularly Belgian Blue and Piedmontese cattle, are famous for their unusually muscular appearance. This phenomenon is often called double muscling. The researchers found mutations in the bovine MSTN gene, the gene that produces myostatin. In other words, nature had already created animals in which the muscle growth brake was partly broken. The result was not simply a bigger animal. It was an animal with dramatically increased muscle development. And this raised a question that scientists could not ignore. Could the same thing happen in humans? In 2004, Marcus Schuelke and colleagues published a remarkable case in the New England Journal of Medicine. They described a child with a mutation affecting the MSTN gene. The child showed unusually developed skeletal muscle from a very young age. The case became one of the clearest demonstrations that the myostatin pathway matters in humans too. But there is an important detail here. This does not mean that every person with reduced myostatin activity would suddenly become a superhuman bodybuilder. Human biology is much more complicated. To understand why, first imagine your muscle as a city under construction. Muscle growth requires raw materials, workers, signals, energy, and timing. Myostatin is one of the signals helping regulate that construction. When myostatin binds to its receptors, it activates a signaling pathway involving proteins such as SMAD2 and SMAD3. In simple terms, this pathway carries the slow-down message into the cell. It can influence muscle cell development, and it can also interact with pathways that control protein production and protein breakdown. One important pathway involved in muscle growth is the AKT-mTOR system. Think of mTOR as part of the cell's machinery for deciding when to invest in making proteins. More protein synthesis can support muscle growth. Myostatin can act against that growth-promoting environment. So when myostatin signaling is reduced, some of the molecular brakes on muscle growth are released. But there is another layer. Muscle size is not determined by a single switch. Your muscle is constantly balancing protein synthesis and protein breakdown. Exercise changes this balance. Nutrition changes it. Hormones change it. Age, illness, inactivity, and genetics can change it too. Myostatin is one major regulator inside that enormous network. This is why calling it simply the muscle growth gene is misleading. It is better understood as part of a system that helps control how much muscle your body develops and maintains. Now comes the fascinating part. When myostatin is completely absent in certain animals, the result can involve both hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Hypertrophy means existing muscle fibers become larger. Hyperplasia means the number of muscle fibers increases. These are not the same thing. Imagine a building becoming larger because every room expands. That is closer to hypertrophy. Now imagine the building becoming larger because new rooms are added. That is closer to hyperplasia. Myostatin can influence both processes, especially during development. But in adult humans, muscle growth is largely about making existing muscle fibers larger and increasing their protein content. That distinction matters because it means that turning down myostatin does not magically create an unlimited supply of new muscle. Your body still has physical limits. Your muscles still require energy. They still need amino acids. They still need oxygen and blood supply. Your nervous system still has to activate them. And your bones, tendons, joints, and cardiovascular system still have to support the increased muscle mass. So what happens if myostatin is reduced? The answer depends on how much it is reduced, when the change occurs, and what other biological pathways are doing at the same time. A complete loss of myostatin function is very different from a modest reduction. And a genetic mutation present from development is different from temporarily blocking myostatin in an adult. This distinction becomes extremely important when scientists start thinking about medicines. For years, researchers have explored whether blocking myostatin could help people suffering from muscle-wasting diseases. The idea sounds almost perfect. If disease causes muscle to disappear, why not release the biological brake and allow muscle to grow? Animal experiments produced exciting results. Various approaches to blocking myostatin signaling increased muscle mass in experimental models. But then humans reminded science of something important. More muscle does not automatically mean proportionally more useful strength or better physical function. Clinical development of myostatin targeting therapies has been much harder than the early animal results suggested. A 2025 review by Brock Wetzlich, Bernard Nyakundi, and Jinzheng Yang highlighted this problem. Despite extensive research and promising preclinical findings, clinical trials targeting myostatin inhibition in muscle disorders have generally not produced the large improvements in muscle function that scientists hoped for. Why? Because muscle is not an isolated tissue. A stronger muscle still needs healthy nerves to control it. It needs functioning tendons to transfer force. It needs a working cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen. It needs metabolic systems capable of supporting its activity. And the myostatin pathway itself does not operate alone. Other members of the same signaling family can interact with related receptors. This means blocking one signal may not produce the simple results scientists expect. It is like removing one speed limit sign from a complicated highway system and assuming every car will suddenly travel twice as fast. The road still has other limits. And there is another surprising issue. Myostatin may be a brake, but brakes exist for a reason. Your body does not maximize every biological feature. It balances them. More muscle requires more energy to build and maintain. More mass can increase mechanical demands on the skeleton and connective tissues. And biological systems often involve trade-offs. Evolution is not trying to create the strongest possible human. It is trying to produce a body that can survive, reproduce, repair itself, and function efficiently under its environment. So a permanently broken myostatin brake may give you more muscle, but that does not automatically mean it gives you the perfect body. This is also why the idea of using myostatin inhibition as a shortcut for bodybuilding is much more complicated than social media often makes it sound. The biology is real. The exaggerated promises are another matter. There is no simple switch that says block myostatin and guarantees unlimited muscle growth without consequences. Researchers are still investigating how different ways of targeting the pathway affect muscle mass, strength, metabolism, and other tissues. And genetics gives scientists an extraordinary natural experiment. Recent large genetic studies have provided evidence that people carrying function-disrupting MSTN variants tend to have more lean mass and greater muscle strength, although the exact effects vary between individuals. That is important because it moves the story beyond mice. It tells you that the human myostatin pathway really can influence body composition and muscle performance. But it also reinforces the bigger lesson. Genes do not operate like isolated buttons. They operate like networks. Turn one pathway down, and other pathways respond. Change muscle growth, and the rest of the body has to accommodate that change. So imagine that you were born with a naturally occurring mutation that dramatically reduced myostatin activity. You might develop unusually large muscles. You might have greater muscle strength. You might carry less body fat in some circumstances. But you would not suddenly escape biology. You would still need energy. You would still age. You would still get injured. And your muscles would still exist inside a body made of thousands of interacting systems. That is what makes myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy so fascinating. The real story is not about a secret gene that can turn you into a superhero. It is about discovering that your body has its own internal limits on growth. A tiny protein can act like a brake. Remove the brake and the muscle responds. But the response reminds you that biology is never just about one part. The mighty mouse, the double-muscled cow, and the rare human case all point toward the same conclusion. Your muscle has an internal conversation about how big it should become. And myostatin is one of the voices saying, not too much. So the next time you look at a muscle and think growth is simply about training harder, remember what is happening underneath. Your body is not only asking how to build more muscle. It is also asking when to stop. And imagine waking up one morning to that truth. The most powerful thing in your body was never the signal telling you to grow. It was always the tiny biological brake telling you when enough is enough.